The Sigma 150 to 600 mm is a quite popular lens for animal and especially bird photographers, mainly because you get up to 600 mm of focal length and you get them for not so much money. This one retails around $900 US. And I actually started with a very similar lens like 12 years ago. I bought the Sigma 150 to 500 mm, so the predecessor. And to be honest, that lens was the reason I finally switched to the Canon 500mm f4, mainly because of the not so nice image quality when I zoomed in completely at 500mm. You could get a bit better image quality with stopping down, but then I was at f8 and the background rendering was not so nice anymore. I had the problem with high ISO and so on. So I was kind of curious if Sigma improved and if the successor, the 150 to 600mm contemporary, performed better. So luckily a workshop participant of mine was giving me this lens for almost a month now to really test and try, and I took a lot of pictures both in Spain and in Switzerland. I think it was around 6,000 pictures in the end, and I tested it in different weather conditions, different subjects, different light and so on. And I will compare it throughout this video once or twice with the Canon RF 100 to 500mm, just because I think this is the, well, the closest equivalent from Canon that Canon has in their lineup to the Sigma, even though I completely agree and understand that this Canon RF 100 to 500 costs about 3 times as much as this. So basically in this video I want to see how well does this perform for bird photography, starting with image quality, with the image stabilizer, autofocus, how does it handle in the field. And I also want to give the ones of you that already own this lens some tips and hints of how you can kind of get the most out of this lens on your Canon EOS R camera. And since this will be a bit a longer video, I divided it in different chapters. So if you're only interested in one part of the video, just jump to this point. So the first time I picked up this lens, I immediately noticed that it's way heavier than, for example, the RF 100 to 500. It weighs around 1.9 kilograms, so 600 grams more than the 100 to 500. And you also feel it if you hold it in the hand during photography. And especially if you go just walking around like this for 1 or 2 hours, in the end you definitely feel it, especially if you're in awkward positions. But still, it's better than my 600 f4. It's also much larger, so the length, of course, without the lens hood is around 26 centimeters, plus then of course the RF EF adapter, just meaning that it's a bit harder to fit this in your backpack if you have a smaller backpack or already a big lens in it. But I also need to say that for most people that buy this lens, this will probably be the only big lens they own, so I think then it doesn't matter too much. When you zoom in, the lens extends quite a bit. And I would still prefer if the zooming would be a bit quicker, but at least you can do it like with one turn of your hand. So that's quite nice. What is definitely less nice is the focusing ring here. For me, this is just too small, too tiny. Especially when I had the lens cover over the lens, I found it a bit hard to find this focus ring. And I used it more often than I was expecting, so this was a bit a bummer. Let's switch here to all the switches and buttons we have. So you have a lock switch here for the focal length. So now I cannot zoom anymore. I can put this at 150 or 600 millimeters. I actually never used it because even if you don't use it, the lens stays like this. So it's not expanding or retracting without you wanting to. So I didn't need it, but nice that it's there. Then obviously you have the autofocus manual focus switch with the middle option of manual override. I just left it in autofocus all the time. Just below is the focus limiter, which can be set to full, infinity to 10 meters or 10 meters to 2.8 meters. 2.8 meters is also the minimum focus distance of this lens, which yeah, it's not too bad. I mean, for bird photography, this is more than enough usually. If you also want to do some, well, casual macro photography, like some butterflies, dragonflies, or maybe a portrait of a smaller bird, then it can be a bit too much. Here I preferred the, I think, 1.2 meter of my 100 to 500, but it's really not too bad. And I think the distance on the focus limiter makes a lot of sense. So if I'm at a feeder in my garden and I have songbirds that are like 6-7 meters away, I feel quite comfortable having it at 2.8 to 10 meters. On the other hand, if I take pictures of flying birds, I'm happy to put it to 10 meters to full, just to prevent this focus hunting. And then I can be quite confident that the birds are not coming closer than 10 meters. For example, with my 600mm f4, it's 16 meters to infinity. And there I find it a bit of a weird position, because sometimes I have birds that, yeah, start at 16 meters, but then they end at 13 or 12. So I definitely prefer this here. Just below is the image stabilizer, which has the positions off, 1 and 2. 1 is like the same as with Canon, it goes in all directions. 2 is stabilizing only one of the axes. And on the bottom you have the switch for custom functions, C1 and C2, or obviously you can turn it off. And for this you need the Sigma dock that you can purchase separately. I wanted to use it to try if I can fine-tune the lens a bit, but actually it didn't work for me. It was just saying connection to Sigma server failed. I don't know why. I definitely had internet on my computer, but then I just gave up. But anyway, the lens had the newest firmware installed. I could just not tweak the settings anymore from there. On front you have a 95mm screw-in filter diameter, which can be nice, I think, if you want to maybe take some long exposures and you want to put an ND filter. One example would be a dipper or a heron or any bird like in a stream, or maybe if you want to use it a bit for landscape photography, between 150 and 300mm can also be used for that. So you can definitely mount something there. It's quite big, but it works. And there is obviously also the lens hood. I say obviously, even though Canon is not providing this stuff with non-L glass, so happy that Sigma is. One thing I didn't like so much with the lens hood is somehow, it's hard to explain, but I found it a bit more difficult to like really fix it. So you really need to make sure that you hear the click. Otherwise, it happened to me once that I lost the lens hood, and this was really annoying. I needed to go look for it in the park, and it had the lens cover on it, so it was very hard to spot. The camouflage did a good action. But yeah, after 1 hour of looking, I found it again. And overall, the lens, I mean, the finish is quite nice. Of course, it's not like a Canon L glass, but still it feels way better than, for example, a RF 100 to 400. And also, if you look at the back here, there is like this rubber that is providing kind of a seal between the camera and the lens. As I said in the beginning, the main reason I switched from the 150 to 500mm Sigma to another lens was that I was not happy with the sharpness at 500mm if I had the maximum aperture, so 6.3 dialed in. So I was kind of curious how the image quality would look like on this lens. And I kind of subdivided this chapter into 2 parts. So the first one is in this chapter, and that's the kind of theoretical sharpness that we can get with this lens if everything else is perfect. So this means like mounted on a tripod, the focus fits and everything else is okay. And here I compared it to the 100 to 500 from Canon at different focal length. But for now I will just focus on the focal length of 500mm, because I think most people will use this one most of the time between 400 and 600mm anyway. So 500 is kind of nice, and then I can directly compare it to the Canon 100 to 500mm. So if we zoom in the middle of the picture, we can see that the Canon is sharper. You see more micro contrasts and so on. This was at the maximum aperture. If we stop down to f8, we see kind of a similar picture. The Canon is clearly sharper. If this is an issue to you or not is up to you to decide, but I think 12 years ago I would have been happy with this sharpness. Now this was the center. Let's move a bit to this edge of the image, not the corner, just the edge. And here we can see a big difference. Even if we stop down to f8, the Canon is much, much sharper. How important are edges of the frame in animal photography? I think in general not so important as in landscape photography, where we often want to have the whole frame sharp until the corners. In animal photography, for example, if you have a bird in the middle of the picture, you don't care about the edges or the corners. So often you will maybe not notice this. But there are some exceptions. For example, if you have a heron or an egret that is like filling almost the frame and the head is a bit positioned like my head now on the top of the frame, it will be a bit less sharp than if I would go down and would be in the center of the frame. Another example is if you try to take some pictures a bit more like animals in the landscape, like with a lower magnification, and you just have the bird or whichever picture a bit in the corner, then you will see that it's not as sharp as in the middle. So if you need to crop afterwards anyway, maybe you can position it a bit more in the center, but up to you. Overall, I still felt this was not too bad. At least I was not using it so much that I put it that extremely in the corner. So again, not a deal breaker, but we see that the Canon is much better here. So I think in real life, I would not hesitate to use this at the maximum aperture of 6.3 in the field. However, this was just a theoretical part. There are some other things that need to work out that you get a sharp image in the end, and let's get to them now. The first one is autofocus. So one small technical thing about the autofocus, actually you cannot put the autofocus field completely in the corner. You have a bit a smaller window where you can move the autofocus points. It's still bigger than all DSLRs I ever had. It's still larger than with the RF 800mm f11. So for me this was not a big deal. Just when you switch from one lens to another, you feel that it's a bit smaller, but that's okay. What I was more annoyed is how the autofocus behaved. So first of all, if there were kind of some distracting elements, like some grass in the foreground, some twigs, often the eye autofocus was not working well. And you can see this on this blackbird here. For most of the time, it was just focusing on a twig. It's not the end of the world. You can use spot autofocus, but I was just used with my other lenses that the detection autofocus isn't working there. Another thing is that it's kind of having sometimes like this pumping behavior. I don't know how to say, but like it's looking for the focus, then it has the focus, and then it loses it again for no obvious reason. And this is really a bit annoying because you have the bird locked on and then it loses it again. The bird is maybe doing something cool and you miss the shot. In general, I had the feeling that this was more a problem if it was a low contrast scene. So for example, blackbirds that don't have so much contrast in their feathers. And also if it was like in darker environment, especially below a tree. So this sounds pretty bad, and yes, I was disappointed. But we also need to think about in which kind of situations is this a problem. So if you go out on a nice day, even if it's overcast and still quite bright, or maybe better if it's sunny, you will not have many issues. Maybe the eye detection autofocus is not working so well, but if you just use the single point or spot autofocus, you will be able to focus. I was also taking several like shots of flying birds, of flying doves, of seagulls that were flying past me, even on overcast days, and it worked just fine. One disclaimer here regarding the autofocus, I was just testing this on my Canon R5. I don't know how it behaves on other Canon EOS R cameras like the R7 or R6 Mark II, and especially not how it works with DSLR cameras. The next point on my list is the image stabilizer. If I use a, let's say, light lens like this one, I don't want to carry a tripod around to support it. So I shoot handheld all the time. Even with my 600mm f4, I shoot handheld 90–95% of the time. So I never mounted this on a tripod. Well, in a height technically for a few minutes. But otherwise I didn't mount this on a tripod. I was doing everything handheld. And here I felt huge differences to the Canon RF 100–500 or even to my, by now, like 11-year-old Canon EF 600mm f4. The image stabilizer here, it works, but it doesn't work so well. It's still better than the one I have in my 150mm macro lens from Sigma. There I have the feeling is no difference if I turn it on and off. And here I made some test shots with the image stabilizer off and on, and there was a small difference, but really not as huge as I was hoping for. And I was then comparing it to the RF 100 to 500 millimeter, just handheld, how many sharp shots do I get? 500 millimeters with 1/100th of a second. With the Canon, I got 100% sharp images. With the Sigma, 15. So that's already not so good, but hundredths of a second is still not such a long shutter speed. With the RF 100 to 500, I remember doing a 50th of a second or a 30th quite frequently. So I was trying 1/25th of a second. And with the Canon, I still got 70% of the pictures sharp, and with the Sigma, 5%. This just means if you are in a low light situation, you cannot or don't want to use a tripod, you will need to take a lot more pictures to get a sharp one with this lens. And at some point I found it almost impossible to get sharp pictures, or maybe the bird is not staying for as long as you want. With the Canon, as I said, with 25th of a second, if you take 2 pictures, probably you have one of them is tag sharp, so you're good. With the Sigma, you need to take at least 20 to have, just statistically speaking, one sharp image with it. And it's not clear if the bird stays so long. So I was not so happy about this, and also it's more work afterwards with culling the images. And I also noticed when I mounted the lens on the tripod for testing the image quality, that the image stabilizer was kind of still moving, like it had some kind of inertia. This was a bit annoying, and I'm not used to this, like in this behavior from other lenses that I own. Apart from the image quality that I already mentioned, one reason that I switched to a 500mm f4 like 12 years ago was to have this nicer bokeh or like a more blurry background. And here nothing has changed. I'm still at f6.3. So how is it in the real life? Because most of the time I'm shooting with my 600mm f4. I need to say it's still possible with this lens to get a nice blurry background, and actually I was surprised how easy it is or how good it works in most of the cases. So I was really positively surprised here. And I think what matters more here is like how you photograph. So for example, take this picture of a blackbird that I just laid down in the grass, took some pictures. They're okay, the background is kind of out of focus, but it's boring. And then I moved a bit so that in the background I would have some trees and some bushes that were like hit by the last sunlight of the day. And therefore you get these kind of flares in the background. And this comes down to personal preference, of course, but to me the second image is much more appealing. It has more life in it. And I just want to say with this lens, I think you're very well equipped to take nice pictures with out of focus background, maybe also an interesting background. I think here you more need to know how you do it, but then it's definitely feasible. As promised in the beginning, I want to give you some tips for more sharp images if you shoot with 150 to 600mm. First of all, I was just using the spot or single point autofocus way more often because, as I said, the eye detection autofocus was not so reliable, or at least really using the spot or single point to kind of pre-focus and then switch to the eye autofocus. Sometimes this was working. Then second of all, sometimes even the spot autofocus was still showing this kind of pumping behavior. So here I was switching to the single point autofocus, which is larger, therefore less precise, but I had more chances of the focus actually locking on the bird. Finally, there are a lot of AF functions in the camera and in the lens that you can adjust. And for this, Duade Payton, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, an Australian YouTuber, made an awesome tutorial. I will link it below. I really don't want to repeat what he said because he did some great work on this, so go check this out. Finally, for the image stabilizer problems, well, it's kind of obvious, but just take a shorter shutter speed. I was usually really forcing myself to take a shorter shutter speed, also shorter than with my big 600mm f4. And then this goes for the image stabilizer and the autofocus, just take more pictures. I know it's a bit annoying because you need to delete some in the post, but the more pictures you take, the higher your chances are that some of the pictures are really tag sharp as you want them. Obviously, when you use a higher shutter speed, you need to also increase your ISO a bit. So I was using denoise a bit more often with this lens, and also AI Sharpen from Topaz. I would encourage you to try it out. It was helping me in the situations where the autofocus missed by, I don't know, like 2 or 3 millimeters. I was still able to get some of the sharpness back. So let's jump to the conclusion. Who would I recommend to buy this lens, if at all? Well, I think to answer this, we first need to see what are the competitors, or at least the alternatives. So from Canon, I think there is the 100 to 400 millimeter lens, the RF version that is even a bit cheaper than this. It is obviously 200 millimeters shorter, and you have an f8 lens. So the background rendering will not be so nice. But if you're like more a beginner photographer, I think you would have more fun with the 100 to 400, just because it's so much lighter, autofocus works reliable, image stabilizer is amazing, you can really do a lot handheld, also like with cool perspectives. So I would definitely go for the 100 to 400 if you're a beginner. If on the other hand you already know a bit about bird photography, you know how to use the autofocus properly, like moving the field around, you're also fine with sometimes interfering with manual focus, and you kind of want more this autofocus background look, then I think this lens is nicer, just because you have more options. Just be prepared that you might be a bit more frustrated sometimes, or you will have more images to sort out later. The other lens I want to mention here is the 100 to 500 that I actually mentioned a couple of times in the video. And obviously the 100 to 500 is a better lens in almost every way. It's lighter, it's sharper, better autofocus, amazing image stabilizer. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. The only big downside in my point of view is the price point. So the RF 100 to 500 costs about 3 times as much as the Sigma. Okay, the Sigma also has 100 millimeter more focal length, but for me this was not even that big of a deal. It's mostly, I think for most people, the price point that this is really an affordable solution. But yeah, just be prepared that it's not as easy to use as a 100 to 400 or 100 to 500, and I really wish Canon would do something about it. Let's look at Sony, for instance. They have the 100 to 400 that is comparable to the 100 to 500 from Canon. Quite expensive, a bit a shorter lens, very nice. And then they also have the 200 to 600. The image stabilization of the lens is not as good as the 100 to 400. The autofocus not as good. The image quality, it's a bigger lens, but it's still doing everything very, very well. And I just wish Canon would bring something like this. A 200 to 600 from Canon, it can also cost a bit more. If it costs $1,300 US, I think so many people would buy it, and it would be probably a much better choice than this one. So yeah, it's a bit hard to give a final recommendation. I just hope this video helped you. If yes, I would also be happy if you could support me either over a channel membership or just a super thanks. Anyway, thanks for watching and hopefully see you soon. Bye.